There's some gun legislation at the State House that you may want to pay attention to as we head toward the final turn of the session this year.
The Dan Yorke State of Mind program is brought to you in part by Lookout Rhode Island and Takeo Comfort Solutions.
Jerry Belair runs the Rhode Island Coalition Against Gun Violence, and he is my guest tonight. You know, anytime you say gun, everyone's ears perk up on both sides of the issue. If you have nothing to do and you're feeling lazy as a radio talk show host, you can just start talking about guns. Sit back, put your feet up, and let people fight. I'm never that nonchalant because I think the issues are very important, but my point is there's certain things that are guaranteed to have people go and guns, anything, one of them. You can't take that kind of, you know, again, nonchalant disposition, though, when it comes to these conversations, because they're incredibly important. In a little bit, we'll play some of Donald Trump's drooling over the whole thing and see if we can make some sense of that. Probably not. Oh, you get upset when I say that Donald Trump is drooling? Some of you do, anyway. Well, you know where you can call me and tell me. Weekdays 3 to 6 on WPRO, where often we have this conversation. Anyway, let me not get into that battle too prematurely here. I'm feeling a little rambunctious today. Let's go to the rundown. By the way, thanks for tuning in to my state of mind. Yeah, you know, I keep banging on this thing because I'm so happy that the Providence Journal has actually spent some print time following the legislative grant situation. And I just want you to know that while this front page story seen here in the headline is not specifically about grants, F. Fitzpatrick actually has a walkthrough with Senator Dennis Algier, kind of a memories type of thing. I guess 15 years ago they did a walk through the State House, and they had another walk through the State House. And Dennis is a perfect gentleman, a nice guy, Republican, you know, one of 3 in the state, I guess. But Ed writes about corruption, you know, and I keep trying to come back to this concept with you, and that is the grant program, a couple of $1 million, not the big grant program that'll end up in the budget the right way, but the couple of $1 million grant program is really at the core of the corruption in this state, because it causes legislators to do things for their own well-being so they can bring home the cheesy check for $500 to $5,000 and look really impressive to the unwitting constituent who reads their story and sees the big cheesy check in the weekly newspaper. Just know that every time we start talking about ethics reform and campaign finance reform and line item vetoes and all those kind of things, those changes, which are just so necessary, don't come because the legislators who have to vote for these issues are bought off by the grants that are waved in front of them so that they can take them home and look relevant. Does that make any sense to you? Again, the moral of the story, now that we've got a caucus with the Democrats trying to figure out the budget tomorrow with Nick Mattiello et al., is to contact your legislator and tell them that you're sick and tired and you will not accept and you will not be part of the market to accept these tiny little grants which stop everything that should be progressive. And I'm not talking about left progressive. I'm talking about progress for quality of life in this state. All right, there's my speech. Governor Kilmartin, we didn't get to this yesterday, but I will tell you, oh, by the way, just a program note, you might have missed this last night at 7:30 on MyRI TV. That was a technical issue that we have resolved, so we apologize for that. And if you missed our guest, who is phenomenal, the owner of this incredible company at Quonset that's making you know, nourishment bars for malnutritioned victims, kids in third world countries. We're going to probably replay that conversation for you on Friday. You might have seen it at midnight, but if you missed it at 7:30, we'll replay it on Friday. Anyway, the other thing that we didn't get to yesterday was this excerpt from Newsmakers from over the weekend. Usually if it's a Newsmakers clip, we'll play it for you on Monday. The Attorney General, who, by the way, is a rumor when it comes to the real things that matter here in this state, got into a little political conversation with Ted and Tim on Newsmakers. If you have gas, you may want to get your Tums and watch this.
In all candor, you know, there's an old quote out there that man makes plans and God laughs. I'm only, what, a year and a half into my second term. there's a whole lot of time left. There's a lot of things that I am focused on completing in the Attorney General's office with upgrades, with building new buildings, updating our consumer unit, real accomplishments that I want to hopefully get done before my term is over. I'm focused on that. Will I make those decisions in the future? Yeah, I haven't closed. I learned a lesson 2008 at this time. I had made a decision I was not going to run after 2010 for state rep, assuming I had won in 2008. I knew that. At that point in time, if you, back to my wife, if you talk to my wife, she will tell you, and she reminds me, you said outright you wouldn't run for Attorney General. And that's what I said at this stage of the game in 2008. Well, that's where we are now, relatively speaking.
Would you consider...
So I've learned my lesson never to say never, and I've also learned, you know, I've always been a person, I've never looked at one office as a jump to the next office. So...
Would you consider challenging Gina Raimondo in the primary?
You know, that's all speculation. I haven't considered what I'm going to do.
So you won't rule out challenging the governor?
No, what I'm saying is I haven't even thought about anything like that. I'm focused on doing my job, and I'm not trying to be evasive. I'm sincerely not.
He needs kaopectate because he's got diarrhea of the mouth. The attorney. Just answer the questions. I don't know what I'm going to do. I got work to do now. Well, going back to my wife and blah, 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 and you know, blah, and I learned a lesson, and God says this, and blah, blah, blah. You know, listen, if you've always been kind of a hack, you act like a hack all the time. And as a state representative, he was. And listen, this guy won the Attorney General seat with a minority, plurality equation. This notion that he's got things he still wants to do, it's about building buildings and upgrading desks. Did you hear him say, I got to get rid of the corruption issues in this state? Did you hear him say he was going to prosecute ethics mistakes? Did you hear him? I mean, if you watched the first half of the show, you probably were nauseated over the non-answers to very good questions by Tim and Ted about how the Counselor Jackson in Providence case actually developed. This guy has been such a step backwards for the state of Rhode Island when it comes to cleaning up government, holding people accountable, using law enforcement in a white-collar way to be able to change the reputation of this state. All I can ask is that when you're, Mr. Kilmartin, when you're asked if you're ever going to run again, could you please just say, I don't know, which I hope leads to, God, no. Gun politics. Yeah. It's getting kind of funny out there. It's a big lightning rod when it comes to electability, and Donald Trump is probably chafed from riding the fence too closely, too hard. Here's the latest from the network.
Ladies and gentlemen, the next president of the United States, Donald Trump.
When Donald Trump accepted the endorsement of the National Rifle Association, he wasted no time firing shots at Hillary Clinton.
Hillary Clinton wants to abolish the Second Amendment. Just remember that.
Clinton certainly hasn't proposed getting rid of the right to bear arms, but her campaign is seizing on Trump's past position on guns in schools.
I will get rid of gun-free zones on schools. My first day it gets signed, okay?
That idea isn't just way out there, it's dangerous.
At an event in Battleground, Florida, for mothers who have lost children to gun violence, Clinton fired back.
Parents, teachers, and schools should have the right to keep guns out of classrooms. Just like Donald Trump does at many of his hotels, by the way.
Trump tweeted that Clinton was wrong regarding his position on guns in schools, but he struggled to clarify Sunday.
I don't want to have guns in classrooms, although in some cases teachers should have guns in classrooms, frankly.
The issue of guns is tricky for both campaigns. Many Democrats cite Bill Clinton's assault weapons ban as one of the reasons they lost big in the 1994 elections. And in 2008, Hillary Clinton struck a much different pro-gun tone in her presidential run. Then candidate Barack Obama called her out.
How she values the Second Amendment, she's talking like she's Annie Oakley.
Trump hasn't always sided with the NRA on gun policies. In 2000, in his book, The America We Deserve, Trump wrote, "I support the ban on assault weapons and a slightly longer waiting period to purchase a gun, two positions he now opposes."
Okay, for all of you who think he's just, principled and anti-political correctness and all this kind of stuff, I mean, there's no more a chameleon in this political race than Donald Trump. I don't know when you guys are going to figure it out. You may never. I'm not sure. He could win Rhode Island, for heaven's sake, never mind Massachusetts. But that whole guns for teachers, I don't support guns in schools, well, I do, and I don't, well, I do. And it's amazing to me how many of you will actually try to fill in the gaps of his logic so that you can legitimize your support for him. That's crazy. In the meantime, we've got local legislation on gun matters that are kind of dominating the scene. Most in Rhode Island back gun controls for domestic violence convicts. That makes some sense to me. Rhode Island wants gun safety, says an editorial in Providence Journal. This headline, bill to create gun-free zones around schools draws crowd to Senate hearing. Jerry Belair is the board president of the Rhode Island Coalition Against Gun Violence. Jerry, welcome to the broadcast.
Thanks, Dan. Great to see you.
Appreciate having you. You got a reaction to the Hillary-Trump back and forth before we get into some of the local stuff?
Well, Trump, I'm not sure that he's got a clear position on anything. Hillary does have a clear position on guns. She certainly doesn't want to do away with the Second Amendment, never has. I've never heard her call for banning guns ever. And I remember marching with Hillary in 2000, I think at the Million Mile March in Washington, D.C. So she's been a strong supporter of safe, common sense gun laws. Never called for banning guns or for doing away with the Second Amendment.
And neither do you?
Absolutely. I'm a gun owner. I've been a gun owner my whole life.
Explain that to people.
Well, I was brought up in New Hampshire. I was taught to handle guns relatively young. I've hunted in New Hampshire. I've hunted in Canada. I had a handgun permit in license to carry in Massachusetts when I was there. So I've been a gun owner my whole life. This isn't about the Second Amendment. This is about gun safety. It's about keeping guns out of schools. It's about taking guns away from domestic violence offenders. It's for doing the right thing. Background checks for every single gun purchase. 40% of guns are sold in this country without a background check. 40% of guns. Where do you think the criminals are getting these guns? It's obvious where they're getting them. We have to stop that. We need background checks. We need common sense legislation.
All right, when we come back, we'll dig into each of those local issues one at a time. Don't go anywhere. That's the website for the Rhode Island
Coalition Against Gun Violence.
Coalition Against Gun Violence. RICAGV, to be exact. Jerry Belair heads that organization, and we're here to talk about a couple of issues at the State House right now. We'll take them one at a time in each of these segments. The first, we already showed you the headline, but I want to remind you of the concept of the conversation. Most in Rhode Island back gun controls for domestic violence convicts. Explain what the data says and what you're trying to legislate.
Well, in Rhode Island, on the federal level, misdemeanor domestic violence offenders are banned from having guns. This is a case where Rhode Island's laws are actually weaker than the federal laws. So we do not ban guns from domestic violence offenders. In fact, our law says that felony domestic violence offenders are banned for only 2 years. The federal law obviously bans all felonies from having guns at all times.
So how does that?
Well,
how do those two sets of laws coexist?
Well, because the feds aren't going to prosecute here in the state unless there's they just don't have the capacity to do it. And so unless the federal people came in and prosecuted, there would be no prosecution whatsoever. Okay. So 92% of the people that we polled in Rhode Island feel that domestic violence misdemeanors should prohibit somebody from having a gun. And we agree with that. We've worked closely. We have 92 member organizations in our coalition, and one of them is the Coalition Against Domestic Violence. We worked with them at length to try and determine where the greatest risks were of people who were convicted or are charged with domestic violence offenses. And so we structured this particular bill to try and resolve those conflicts.
What does this specifically do?
This bill just says that if you are a domestic violence offender, if you've been convicted of a domestic violence offense, you can no longer possess a gun.
Period.
Period.
For how long a period of time?
Period. Forever. Which is consistent with the federal law. And the federal law, by the way, was upheld, U.S. v. Castleman was upheld by 9 members of the Supreme Court, including Antonin Scalia, for misdemeanor domestic violence offenders. So it was taken to the Supreme Court by somebody who was denied a gun, and by a 9-0 vote, it was upheld.
What's the data show about domestic violence convicts and their use of weapons?
Well, you know, for one thing, of the mass shootings, the majority of mass shootings, 1/3 of mass shootings are done by domestic violence offenders. It's a very serious problem. Many women are killed by people who possess handguns that are that tend to be domestic violence offenders. So, you know, if you can't control yourself to keep your hands off of a domestic partner, we don't think you could control yourself well enough to be in possession of a gun.
What's the traction at the State House?
You know, I think we've got something this year. This is our 3rd year in a row. We've not had great results because I think the leadership on the House side is, you know, he's got an A, the Senate, the House.
Speaker Mattiello.
Yeah, Mattiello has a A+ rating from the NRA. And, you know, what he says generally goes. So we're hoping this year that there's been enough pressure, enough testimony. I mean, people have come out, you know.
Are you out of hearing? Has it been held for further study, or is it in the hopper?
It's held for further study, as always. It seems all 3 of our bills are held for further study again, in both the House and the Senate side. And we have
you feel like you're voting against the wind here?
No, we'll keep coming back. I mean, we're never going to give up. We'll keep coming back as long as we have to, and you know, they'll be gone before we are. We'll be around forever. So, at some point, you know, there's going to be changes. People are going to get elected that support us, and people are going to be gone that don't. Things change. So this year, hopefully, I think that there's enough. We've provided them with enough evidence that the people look. Let's be honest. The people of Rhode Island want this. 92% of them want this. Every single argument. We've had
92% of them will respond affirmatively to your question, but 92% actively get up in the morning saying they want this. There's a big difference between the two.
24 school committees have passed resolutions in support of this law. 24.
Which one? The domestic violence?
I'm sorry. That was on
you just jumped
no
ship.
guns in schools. I jumped.
Well, that's a good segue, because I got to pause
right.
anyway. When we come back, we'll talk about the guns in the schools as well, because there's some nuances to existing law you may not know about. Stay with us. Welcome back. There's some data here that you apparently want to look at in terms of gun issues. Number of deaths, firearms in the United States a few years about, it takes a while to accumulate the data. 33,000 deaths per 100,000 population, 10.6. These are CDC numbers, Centers for Disease Control. Domestic violence, homicides in Rhode Island. Wow. Wow. That's a lot of lives lost from that decade's period of time. Seems like it's about an average. Actually, 2016, it looks like we're ahead of pace, unfortunately, if you do the math. Yeah. Right? 10 years, 5 to 4, it'll be 5.5 a year-ish. And this is only May. Excuse me, a little frog in the throat. You, Jerry, you're running this coalition against domestic violence, against gun violence. But the school issue is kind of unique. There's an existing law that most people don't really understand, and there's new legislation that you want to pass. Tell me about it. Well, pardon me if I cough a little dry throat. Go ahead.
The existing law says that no weapons are allowed in school. However, when you go to Section B, it says that there are 3 exemptions. One of those exemptions is law enforcement, and another exemption is anyone with a concealed carry permit. So by virtue of that exemption, I'm not sure they intended it. This was done in 1990. I'm not sure that they intended it. But by virtue of that exemption, anyone with a concealed carry permit, untrained people, I mean, that just have a concealed carry permit, not law enforcement, can carry a gun to any function, on a school bus, at a hockey game, at a parent-teacher conference, at a school committee meeting,
So what
at any of these
What's
events.
the worry about that? Do we have data that says that those people are actually using them and putting people in danger?
No, but what we're afraid of is accidents. For instance,
You have data that says accidents have occurred?
well,
I mean, a
here
lot of
in
them?
Rhode Island,
Yeah.
not in Rhode Island yet, because we think that not a lot of people even realize that concealed carry permits are allowed, because the schools have passed regulations saying some schools have that you can't bring guns onto school grounds.
That's a local system regulation, correct?
Right, but it doesn't.
There's no teeth.
Right. So if somebody actually was discovered with a gun in school, they would just say, look, it's state law, you know, you're preempted from denying me the right to do that.
Yeah.
So what we have is, for instance, last week in Kansas, somebody was at a high school graduation and adjusted a gun that was in his sock, shot himself in the foot. The bullet also ricocheted and hit somebody else, nearly killed him. It cut through an artery and they got her to the hospital just in time to save her. In Utah, which is the only other state that has unregulated concealed carry other than Rhode Island in the country, a school teacher shot herself in the basement, in a bathroom, in a school bathroom. In Colorado, a school teacher was going to drive one of his students home, and he was transferring his gun from his coat to his car and shot the student by accident. So these things are occurring, and these are the things that we're concerned about, that there's going to be some kind of accident. Look, a lunch lady with a Glock, or a janitor with a handgun.
I'm conflicted over this because it doesn't, although those are random stories, it's a big country. It doesn't seem like you've got any big trend. At the same time, we tend to write laws after a crisis or a tragedy.
Right, that's correct.
Right? So, I mean, I'm arguing myself in this particular situation, and I think there are a lot of gun issues that have reasonable people arguing both sides. In fact, you could probably play act both sides of many gun issues depending on your commitment or experience or tragic involvement. What I'm concerned about is this notion that even Donald Trump is talking about guns in schools. Teachers yes, teachers no. I don't want to see any guns in schools, period, unless they're holstered by a police officer who should be assigned. We assign police officers to junior and senior high schools. We don't assign them to our precious cargo, the little elementary school kids. It drives me crazy. So, I mean, that's a slight derivation from what you're talking about. You getting any traction on this possession prevention?
I think we are. You know, we're an outlier. We're only one of two states. We're an outlier, and I think it was accidental. We've had 24 school committees who have passed resolutions in favor of this legislation. We've had so far 9 town and city councils that have passed resolutions in favor of this legislation, and we have a poll that shows over 80% of Rhode Islanders want this legislation passed. So the entire world, you know, Rhode Island world, is for this legislation. The only people against it are the gun law.
How many other states have this particular law you want to have?
Well, there are only 2 states that allow. There's only Rhode Island and Utah that allow guns in school. Like,
period.
Right.
That's something to contemplate. Stay in touch. We'll have you back. Thanks. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Final word when we get back. Wow. You know, some of this gun legislation is interesting, and some of the polling data is interesting as well. Some folks will be adamantly against a proposed gun control measure unless and until they are actually informed about a current law or current situation, and then they change, which is okay. The key here is that you ought to be open-minded about gun legislation. Being fixed and entrenched doesn't help society at all. Should be an open dialogue. I'll see you on the radio tomorrow at 3 on WPRO and back here tomorrow night. Thanks for watching.